I'm going to turn it over to Councilmember Derek Green for the next portion of our event. Councilmember.
Thank you, Steve. We're going to have our next panel. We're starting now, and I hope my panelists will be coming on very shortly. And this is going to be an excellent opportunity to talk about what is happening in jurisdictions around the country and get a perspective on the public banking movement. You heard from Walt McRee earlier, country.
All right. Thank you very much, Derek. Appreciate it. I've got 7 minutes to tell you what's going on around the world and around the country, and a very dynamic movement. And frankly, and it is a movement, a vibrant movement for public banking across the country. I'll show you a map in just a moment of some of the actions that are going on. But I think it's important as context that we look at how public banking exists in the ecosphere of public finance globally. Public banking is not a new thing, as many of you may know. Been around for hundreds of years, frankly. Germany's had it for a couple of hundred years. Well established in dynamic economies across the world. China, Japan, Germany, Russia, India, Costa Rica, Ecuador, many others. In fact, the China revolution in infrastructure development is driven by the ability that it has to create its own credit, its public banking. So there are over 900 public banks around the globe, and they control about $50 trillion in assets. Now, here in North America, the largest public bank is actually in Canada. It's the Alberta Treasury branch, and it's many times larger than our famed Bank of North Dakota, which of course is the sterling U.S. model. We compare everything to the model of how the Bank of North Dakota has been so successfully exercising the principles of banking, of public interest banking, for 102 years. But there is another new United States public bank, and it is offshore a ways. It's the Territorial Bank of American Samoa. So we finally have a new bank in the 21st century, a new public bank, but it will not be the last, I promise you. The stateside, we have this really remarkable amount of movement, as I was saying, and here's just a quick look. I'm going to put this up for you for a while. This is the look at what's going on in the U.S., of course, and that is you'll see that there's a lot of action out west. That it is really about the organizations in these locations are very impressive. In stateside, we've got California activity all over the state. They really, actually, a couple of years ago, in 2019, California broke through and actually broke through legislatively and codified public banks. In other words, making it legally possible, legislatively possible for cities like Los Angeles, San Francisco, and as you see on the map, all of those cities are looking at creating public banks of their own. That codification, that law really did lay out the ways in which these banks would need to be developed, what they would be required to have and show, business plans, FDIC insurance, et cetera, et cetera. The details are, I can let David Jette or Shamann from the West Coast, from California and San Francisco, tell you about that. But the motivations for creating these banks in California largely came from citizen uprising and annoyance with the fact that their tax money was going to the global banks that were investing heavily in fossil fuels and private prisons, payday lenders, and a variety of other social and community concerns that they really wanted to divorce themselves from. So that's kind of one of the things, and we, of course, see that as an impetus for other banks as well. As we move up the coast, the states of Oregon and Washington have been kind of in the public banking development sphere for the last 10 years. Oregon now looking again at a state bank. Washington State has also a new legislation on the table, which is quite interesting because they're looking at creating a cooperative styled institution that would allow voluntary participation by any municipality that wants to pool resources, pool capital, and then and create more cost-effective funding for infrastructure. So that's a very exciting prospect. And finally, after 10 years of trying, it looks like with a growing caucus of public bank supporters in the Senate, they may well be successful. Also out in the West, Colorado has been on board for a couple of years and trying to put that together. It's interesting to see the kinds of challenges that all of these organizations or all of these initiatives have. Challenges that come from bankers associations, from the momentum of the status quo, as I like to say, for legislators who don't want to really ruffle anything or don't want to try anything new. So, but New Mexico being one of those, started about 2014. That state now is going to have new legislation on the books at the start of next year. So, and that's very favorable. Now we have some state treasurers that are also coming along to help take the lead. What we've noticed now, as moving east here, you can see that most of the Northeast has had at one point or another some real strong efforts to create public banks. What we've noticed, though, and Philadelphia is fortunate to have, is that it really makes a difference to have an elected champion. So Councilmember Derek Green has been a champion for that. Across the river, Governor Phil Murphy has really led and made it part of his campaign and also part of his administration to create a state bank. He created a public bank implementation board, not just a study, but an implementation board. They've been on the job for about 18 months. The governor says it's harder than he thought, but at least it's still in the works. And there's some interesting ideas that are being put forward to do that. I have to speed up here. The Massachusetts now has a couple of legislative initiatives in both houses. Their focus is on meeting financial needs of cities and towns, affordable housing, supporting CDFIs, and also a very strong component of supporting racial justice. The Black Economic Council of Massachusetts and the Boston Ujima Project are both strong supporters. So we're hoping that Massachusetts will come along. We really expect with their momentum now that they'll be in a good place to do it. New York, you'll hear from Andy Morrison about state and city initiatives there. Here in Pennsylvania, I just want to give a shout out to the Pennsylvania Project, started by Mike Krause back in 2011, currently still continuing to try to bring the Pennsylvania legislature along. Mike Krause and the Pennsylvania Project started the Philadelphia Public Bank Initiative back in 2011. So now I have to stop apparently because of time, but I just want to point out that public banking also takes the shape on the federal level in a couple of important ways you should know about. The National Infrastructure Bank Coalition. It's going to replicates the model of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation of the 20th century. Very successful, something you guys need to check out. Also postal banking to make banking available at all levels of the community. And finally, the Public Banking Act, which is in Congress, again, to really look at reversioning the Federal Reserve and other steps that can be taken to support the creation of public banks around the country. I'm over time. Derek, it's yours.
And Walt, thank you for all of that great information. If I'm correct, I believe a lot of information can come from the Public Bank Institute website, which is great information. And you gave a great overview of what's happening around the country. And now we're going to get a little more detailed conversation for the next few moments. And getting a sense of what's happening in three specific jurisdictions. We'll hear from the chairman of the president of the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, Shamann Walton, and then we'll hear from David Jette in Los Angeles. He's an organizer with the Los Angeles Public Banking Movement. And then we'll also hear from activist Andy Morrison from New York City Public Banking. So with that, let's go to President Walton to hear what's going on in San Francisco.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Councilmember Green. And just it's exciting to see this public banking summit take place. Really just glad to see what you all are doing in Philadelphia. And I'm just going to give a little bit of historical framework. I know you've heard a little bit about what we're doing here in San Francisco. We've been having a conversation about public banks for several years now. And my colleague, or former colleague, I should say, on the Board of Education and eventually the Board of Supervisors, Sandra Fewer, when she got elected in 2016, began to do the work with the San Francisco Public Bank Coalition and really started focusing on the movement. I got elected in 2018 to serve on the Board of Supervisors, and Sandy and I had so many conversations while serving together on the Board of Education about a public bank, what it would mean for San Francisco, how excited we would be to make it happen. And so I immediately started also speaking with our state assembly member, David Chu. And after several conversations with Assemblymember Chu, we finally got him excited about pushing a bill at the state level that would allow us to be able to authorize our own public banks for municipalities in California. And so in 2019, he pushed through Assembly Bill 857, which allows for that authorization. So much excitement happened when that bill passed. We got hit with a pandemic. It slowed things down a little bit, but we still had just a groundswell of support. So many people pushing to make this happen. When my colleague, Supervisor Dean Preston, came on board and got elected to the Board of Supervisors, that's one of the things he immediately began to work on. So once we got the authorization from the state through Assemblymember Chu's bill, Supervisor Preston put together legislation to create our first San Francisco city-run bank, which was called the Reinvest in San Francisco Ordinance. That passed unanimously at the Board of Supervisors this past June. And it also allowed to set up a Reinvest in San Francisco working group that is doing the work now and looking at models of what a municipal finance corporation could look like here in San Francisco. And that working group is really just charged with looking at opportunities that exist, doing research and coming up with models that may work for us here in San Francisco. As we know from conversations with our city treasurer, if we set up a new bank, we need to have committed capital, which is going to take millions of dollars. We're going to need deposits in order to make loans. And one thing we can't do is use the treasurer's money for bank setup. So the city would have to provide its own seed money to set up our municipal bank here in San Francisco. There are a few models that are being talked about, models with the core purpose for lending and helping small businesses and people purchase homes, model to where we can take over and recreate how the city does our own investments and our own banking and have our own banks that we use for investment. But we really had a few goals for wanting to set up a public bank, and just a few that I'll list off: financing our own small businesses, being able to provide home loans for low-income communities and people who would never have an opportunity to typically have a shot at home ownership. We want to eliminate predatory check cashing practices and make sure people are no longer targeted and suffering from expensive fees if they haven't been able to be a part of a typical bank. Provide savings and investment opportunities for all residents here in San Francisco. It'll also help us create some municipal jobs, which is also something that we get excited about. It'll give us the opportunity to control our own city investments and divest from harmful entities like fossil fuels, as was mentioned earlier. And so that, the movement and the fact that we're now at the point where we're actually going to have some models that are in place for us to look at, research, and come up with the resources for us to make that a reality is something that we're excited about here in the city. I know we had a previous conversation a couple of weeks ago with Councilman Green and some other folks about the public bank and what we're doing in San Francisco. And the question always comes up in terms of how much friction did we have and who opposed this push for us to come up and create our own public bank. And obviously our regular banking institutions had concerns. They really lobbied state legislators to try to stop the bill AB 857 because they wanted to continue to control banking here in the state of California. But we had so many people come together. We were able to beat back the banking lobby and be successful in getting the state bill passed. Of course, getting the bill passed here in San Francisco, which sets us up for success. And there's nothing wrong with a little healthy competition. Obviously, here in San Francisco, we want to be the first public bank in the state. I know Los Angeles is working real hard to do the same. And so we're going to continue to work with community, continue to work with the working group, and come up with a model that's going to work well for San Francisco so we can do all the things we need to help people get ahead here in the city and help people be successful and really look out for individuals who haven't typically had success with our larger banks, our larger private banks. So that's the work we're doing in San Francisco. Again, I appreciate having an opportunity to come here and talk about this. I do apologize as I have to leave in about 5 minutes, and I'll jump back on after a quick press conference. But I want to thank you so much for this platform, Councilman Green, and just for everybody for tuning in. Thank you.
Thank you, President Walton. Let's keep it on the West Coast and let's go to David Jette and hear what's going on in LA.
All right. Thank you very much, Councilmember, and thanks for the invitation. It's really fantastic summit, and congratulations to President Walton for the amazing progress that they're making up in San Francisco. The competition is well received down here. We're doing our best to found a bank in LA. I'll give you the quick rundown on the history of what we have done, and I'll try to get into some specifics because I know people kind of want to know the details here. So we started our public banking movement with divestment coming out of the Dakota Access Pipeline occupation. A lot of activists, especially indigenous rights activists and climate activists, were upset with the city's ongoing business with Wells Fargo and other financiers of that project. They teamed up with racial justice activists and housing and social finance activists who were already in the fight for public banks and divestment, and founded Divest LA, which succeeded in getting Wells Fargo disqualified from banking City of Los Angeles's money. But obviously, you have to go farther than just getting rid of one bank. The movement teamed up with the Public Banking Institute and other movements from around California and started the California Public Banking Alliance, which was the sponsor and one of the chief engines behind AB 857 that President Walton was talking about. That provided the guide rails for public banks and clarified what they are, but also set some pretty strict limitations on what they could do. COVID then happened, and the movement was mildly delayed. But after some work, and after the federal government came in to largely prop up municipal budgets, the story came back around to, well, what about public banks? And we were able to advance our effort here in LA to get an RFP on the make. We think that that's going to be voted on in the next week or so, which will start a 60-day countdown by which consultants will be selected to write a report and hold public hearings in LA on what an LA public bank will be. We're hoping that gets done in time for us to get some share of the second wave of ARPA funds. It's the American Rescue Plan Act, and one of the chief sources of where we'd like to capitalize an LA public bank. So what I'm showing here is a little bit about AB 857, which is the law that passed back in 2019. It requires a business plan or viability study for any bank that wants to get chartered, legislative or voter approval, depending on the scale of the municipality that's sponsoring the bank, and approval of the DFPI, which is our banking regulator, formerly called the Department of Business Oversight. What we're hoping happens here in LA, because we have a lot of cities in a big giant metro area, is that The city of LA itself would be a founding member, bring on other charter members like the city of Burbank, the city of Santa Monica, and contribute to a mutual benefit corporation, which is a nonprofit, non-shareholder corporation, which is one of the valid forms of a public bank here in under AB 857. These are all the things that plan needs to include, and most of them are pretty straightforward. Nothing out of the ordinary. A fiscal analysis of all of the costs, its purpose, how much it's going to cost, and most importantly, an analysis of the cost of doing nothing, of the social and environmental impact of continuing business as usual. What needs to happen for us is that City Council is going to consider this plan. We know that the city charter is not going to need to be amended. This is important to us because I don't know if anyone remembers, back in 2018, we had to fight Measure B, which we lost, which was before AB 857 passed. Here in LA, we tried to amend the city charter to get a bank. AB 857 makes it so we don't have to. However, it does limit the number of banks that can be approved, and it does require us to go through a pretty rigorous process for the formation of a bank and a new government entity. The basic timeline of what we're hoping gets done once we get our plan finished is that once we get our plan started, is that about 5 months of community engagement, stakeholder meetings with labor, with housing groups, with community groups, and business groups to determine really the scope and intended mission of such a bank. Then the establishment of a mutual benefit corporation, and the investment of initial capital, and then the application to the regulator. After that, after a charter is issued, it's probably at least another 2 years before the Federal Reserve and FDIC will participate with such a bank and allow it to expand its services into other more traditional areas of banking. The banks are going to focus on a number of different projects, and I know we've already talked through a lot of these angles. But between all of the work that the city can do, we think that a lot of cities will benefit. And as an example, we'd like to show folks some of the scale that we'd like to achieve, where we think there will actually be an impact. That means a bank that's funded somewhere in the order of 100 to 300 million in equity capital in its first 3 years, growing to assets under 3 billion. This would make a difference, right? LA is a large economy. We're talking about something much larger than North Dakota. And in order to make a difference, we need to get that far. We try to model these things out for City Council, and we have mathematical basic business models in the background that we can share with folks. But these kinds of models don't matter if they're not based on the political realities and the desires of constituencies. So these are always in flux, and we adjust them as we speak to more people. Happy to answer more later, but I really appreciate the opportunity, and I thank and applaud everyone here for this really fantastic summit. Thanks.
And David, thank you for that overview. And if we now can go to Andy Morrison and hear what's going on in New York.
Hi, everyone. So first of all, thank you so much for inviting us to speak today. We're all really excited about the amazing work going on in Philadelphia and really all over the country. New Economy Project is an economic justice center in New York City. And over the last 26 years, we've challenged banks, debt collectors, and other companies that extract wealth from people and neighborhoods of color. At the same time, we advance campaigns to build new institutions that advance cooperative and community-led development as a matter of racial justice and economic democracy. In addition to public banking, we co-founded a coalition in 2012 called the New York City Community Land Initiative to advance community land trusts. And that work has been incredible. It's helped to build a really widespread and exciting movement for CLTs here in New York City. Now, several years ago, we also co-founded and continue to coordinate the Public Bank NYC Coalition, which is a really broad-based group of labor, worker cooperatives, CLTs, community and racial justice groups, and community development financial institutions. And we've advanced as a coalition a package of bills in the New York City Council called the People's Bank Act, which lays critical groundwork for a public bank in New York City. And then we've also advanced legislation at the state level called the New York Public Banking Act, which is kind of inspired by and hopes to build on California's landmark victory that's been discussed today. And then through our work in a coalition called the New York State Community Equity Agenda, we've helped to kind of support public banking movements that are growing all over New York, from Buffalo to Rochester and beyond. So it's a really exciting time here in New York. And I just want to share 3 key insights that have guided our coalition work, and a couple of examples of how those insights have manifested in our campaign work here in New York. So first and foremost, we believe as a coalition that this has to be an organizing effort that builds power to make public banking a reality. We believe that in order to have a bank that actually reflects the values of racial justice and real transformational change, there has to be a broad-based movement for public banking that can generate the requisite political will. And when we first got this coalition off the ground, we surveyed other efforts that had been, great efforts that had taken place around the country, but we often saw that they'd been stymied by feasibility studies and task forces, and often just legislation that had an enthusiastic champion in the legislature, and that was true in New York, but no broad-based support backing up the effort. And so that they would falter. So what we've tried to do is focus a lot of our work on community education and organizing. And in fact, even before we put forward legislation at all, we hosted borough-based town halls where we convened community groups and community members to come talk about what the needs are in historically redlined communities of color, so that we're not creating a bank in a vacuum, but we're creating an institution that would be responsive to the real needs that people are experiencing on a day-to-day basis. Similarly, another insight is that our campaign is not about public banking for its own sake, but really as a vehicle for advancing racial justice and cooperative development. And there's a really exciting movement for a cooperative economy here in New York City, initiatives that include worker cooperatives, community land trusts, and so much more. And a lot of these initiatives are not served by Wall Street banks. And so we've talked about public banking as a way to grow the cooperative economy. And I just want to emphasize that leaders within the Public Bank NYC and public banking movement across New York State come from those movements. So it's not just theoretical. People at the table who are designing the strategy, doing the work, and speaking out publicly about the need for public banking in New York are people who've run financial cooperatives, CDCUs, in historically redlined neighborhoods. They're worker owners who are experiencing firsthand how redlining makes it difficult for them to build wealth in their communities. They're community land trusts that are on the cusp of making huge strides forward and want to have an institution that can invest in them. And then the final insight is that we have framed our campaign as a divest and invest campaign. So in addition to addressing community needs through deep investment, as we've been discussing, public banking would also enable New York City to divest from banks that systematically harm people in communities of color through redlining and other exploitative and extractive activities. And so in New York City, commercial banks hold big Wall Street commercial banks hold the vast majority of public deposits. And so we've been able to kind of shine a light through direct action and other research and media work on the inherent contradiction in having our public dollars, which total in the many billions of dollars, on deposit with banks who then get to profit from our money as they exploit people, fail to serve our own communities, and invest in speculative real estate, slumlords, fossil fuels, and so much more. So just one example of how we've turned this into a political and organizing opportunity is we did a research project and held a direct action down on Wall Street where we showed how much the big banks had siphoned from communities in New York in the form of overdraft and other extractive fees. And so it totaled, just in New York City, $1.3 billion and more across the state of fees during the pandemic that the big banks extracted. And just to give you a sense real quick of how these things come together, because it sounds like I'm out of time, is that we had an event on Wall Street in front of the Charging Bull where we talked about how Wall Street banks were mauling communities through the pandemic, the worst offender was JP Morgan Chase, which is the bank that holds more New York City deposits than any other bank. And that we made the case in clear terms and had worker owners come and talk about their experiences and many others about we need to divest our money from Chase and other banks that continue to harm communities and invest it in a bank that will advance cooperative and community-led development as a matter of racial justice and economic democracy.
Andy, thank you for that overview of New York, and President Walton, as well as David Jette. We gave a really good perspective of what's happening in other cities. I want to give some time for questions and answers because there was a lot of questions in the chat feature. If we can get that information from those that provided questions, because this has been such an engaged conversation, I think we're going to skip our break so we can get right into the questions that people raised, and then we'll go continue with the rest of the program. And as we're teeing up the questions from the chat feature, I guess one of the points I want to raise is how, and this is for both David as well as Andy and President Walton, if you're able to come back, how do you get over the reluctance that someone say, well, a public bank is such a big undertaking. How can we possibly create a public bank? And then also, to some of the naysayers who would say, you know, with all the challenges in public entities, how do we get people comfortable in having a new public institution? And David, President Walton, or Andy, feel free to jump in.
I'll speak to you real quick. We haven't gotten over that hurdle completely ourselves yet. We haven't actually founded a bank and gotten the capital committed, which is, I think, the key thing to overcome. One thing that we were able to do with our legislation was to have a sort of content agnostic bill, right? The ability to create a public bank under AB 857 doesn't make any requirements of what that bank does or who it serves or really even how it's governed. It just requires that those plans are written and that they're approved by a local legislature and constitutional, which would require certain separations of powers, but it doesn't require, for example, democratic input or focus on reversing inequality. Those things are things that we calculated that we would have better chance demanding at the local level where we have more direct influence. And we made effectively the bet that banks wouldn't be founded elsewhere, really get traction where they might actually further harm. In North Dakota, famously, their bank invests in fossil fuels and in the police protecting fossil fuel projects and things like that. So you're not guaranteed to have a good bank under AB 857, and that's part of why we have success. Is that you aim for doable things, but that sometimes means making compromises. I think that we do try to emphasize how similar what we're doing is to other government functions, and just insist that private parties are already doing this with very little effort, basically charging a phantom tax on every dollar the government spends in order to provide basic finance services, which the city could provide itself. And the more that you try to drill down to the reality of how really dependent finance is on government and not the other way around, you start to unravel that assumption in most people's minds. Obviously, there are people who are paid to think otherwise, and there's nothing you can do to convince them.
I'll just add, I can't underscore enough how much in our work we've been aided by the community development credit unions that are really leaders in the coalition. They help, do a lot of the lobby visits. The Lower East Side People's Federal Credit Union, Genesee Co-op Federal Credit Union in Rochester, and many others have been part of those meetings. So when these questions come up, we're able to have people who've run financial institutions talk about how you get a bank off the ground that can responsibly steward public funds. And we've also been supported by great pro bono counsel and just a lot of deep expertise within the coalition. So But at the end of the day, I'll just go back to what I was getting at in my remarks is that I think a lot of these things are political in nature. So like we've experienced this a lot where it's like the moving the goalposts thing, where it's like you get, oh, well, what about this? And then you adequately respond. And then there's just like yet another thing that comes up. So I think that's a common thing that progressives face when we're advancing something transformational. And so we just have to keep building the broad-based support. So, and that's ultimately what it takes to overcome a lot of bad faith concerns that get raised.
From both of you, are there advocates in those that you thought would be more apprehensive to public banking, that you've been surprised that have been much more enthusiastic and become part of the coalition to help move this initiative forward in LA and New York?
I mean, every once in a while we'll get some, well, like I remember the Rochester Chamber of Commerce reached out to us. They saw a news article and they were like, we love this idea. So yeah, it just speaks to, I think in many ways it's extremely radical what we're trying to do. In some ways it's just basic common sense. So I think it appeals to a lot of people in different ways. But that's one example. Certainly had others.
When I talk to Andy, you mentioned that CDFIs and local financial institutions are a big help. I mean, their interest and their interest in partnering with a potential public bank under terms that, from my judgment, seem good, right? Equitable and generative, and not overly onerous. There's willingness to engage with even low yield, but also low risk debt and investment. The institutional investment community is seeking safe assets, even those with low coupon rates, because there's just not enough of them. The U.S. doesn't issue enough bonds, really, and investors are skittish. So if they could put their money into ESG assets or investments which carried a low chance of default, even at a low return rate, there's appetite for it. And it just takes courage on public entities to create those investments, and also a clarity of thought to know that they're going to offer them within a bounds that they're not going to go outside of, that they're going to resist political pressure from banks, from private capital to ratchet up those yields and put the choke on working people.
It's interesting, when you saw the map earlier that Walt McRee provided, you saw a lot of activity in California, and then you see activity on the East Coast. I think a lot of the activity in California is based on the fact that in California, you're fortunate enough to have enabling legislation at the state level that allows public banks to operate. So David, and then also as Andy, because in New York, you don't have that same dynamic. I know, although there are some bills that have been introduced, same thing in Pennsylvania, we don't have that enabling legislation. Can both of you give some perspectives on how you're navigating the fact that you have statewide entities that regulate banking, and how that impacts your local activity for a bank in LA or New York?
I can start. Yeah, we have the Department of Financial Services in New York that, through the New York Public Banking Act, it would be the entity that provides the special purpose charter to any locality that meets the requirements that are laid out in the bill. And so we've met with DFS and had really productive meetings. And I think it's been a good relationship overall, where we've had the opportunity to talk to them about our perspective and what their role would be, and hear their questions and concerns. And so that's been really good. I think one in a way advantage we have is that DFS is a very powerful regulator, and so it helps us to make the case that people say, oh, well, what about the responsibility, the stewarding public funds and so forth. It was like, well, we have DFS would be the overseer of these banks, just as it regulates and charters and oversees a number of banks that are chartered in New York State. And so it's been helpful to be able to say that. And yeah, that's how it's been going.
Yeah, I'll echo that and say that having enabling legislation gives local electeds and probably public staff confidence that there is a regulator that is preparing for this. After the law passed, a period of regulation writing commenced, and we were, at the California Public Banking Alliance, able to inform that process and submit comment. And we think we had a positive impact on a couple of terms in the law, including jurisdiction. We wanted it to make sure that any public bank could operate anywhere in the state, like any commercial chartered bank. We didn't want them to be limited to a geographic area, which would make them, not really viable. So we were able to engage with that. And then, of course, we can come back with that expertise and that state, permission, and let local officials know, hey, this is how the regulator wants it. This is the path that we have to go down if we want this. It's a lot easier than kind of wandering out into the wilderness. And that's why we have AB 857. We were making progress in the cities, and we ran into city charters, into state law, questions of state law. And that was a big argument for why we needed the law in the first place.
Okay, well, I want to thank President Shamann Walton of the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, as well as David Jette for his work in LA, Andy Morrison for the work you're doing in New York. I think you provide a lot of information about what you're doing in your jurisdictions, as well as guidance for other parts of the country that are looking to go into public banking. And I think they will be able to reach out to you and see the work you've done that can provide leadership so we can bring public banking to other jurisdictions. I'll now pass the microphone to Walt McRee.
All right. Thank you very much, Councilmember. Our next stage of conversation here is to take a look at, the money. As you can imagine, it's going to take some money to start a bank. It's not nobody's surprise. And it'll take a lot of money. But how much and where you get it are the big questions. The answers vary, depending, of course, on a variety of circumstances and available sources. Beyond just startup and the operational overhead, the first order of bank funding is to acquire sufficient capitalization on which it will leverage its loan-making business. Now, where to look for that nest egg is something that our next presenter, Scott Baker, will help us with. Scott is a pioneering voice in the national public banking world about ways to capitalize these banks and how to calculate those needs. Scott takes a broad view of where they might find the available funds. He wrote a book called America is Not Broke. Scott shows where the civic wealth is stored and where citizens can help find it. He's the managing editor of the well-known online news channel Op-Ed News. He's a leading voice in the land taxation movement, and he is a senior advisor to the Public Banking Institute, has been supporting the Philadelphia Public Bank Initiative for much of the past 10 years. Scott, take it away.
Thank you, Walt. Okay, so there's going to be a lot here, so I'm not going to ask people to take notes. If you want to get the slideshow, that the URL is at the bottom, and I'll post that in the chat later. But I wanted to show some screen dumps from the actual reports, and in order to do that, I have to do a slideshow. So where do we get the money? Okay, so the place to look for that really is in the money that's already there, and you can find that in the Comprehensive Annual Financial Report. And every government entity in the country has one. So there are about 200,000 all online, totaling tens of trillions of dollars. Now, the difference between the Comprehensive Annual Financial Report and the budget is only for 1 year and includes the tax funding, whereas the CAFR is all city income, investment, taxation, and enterprise, plus the accumulated wealth over decades, basically forever. So it's the big difference between, for example, your household budget versus your entire statement of net worth. So you can see at the bottom, there's a couple of links where you can find these CAFRs online. And without further ado, I'm going to go to a couple of screen dumps. So when you look at these reports, what you want to do is to find the liquid assets, not the fixed capital, because roads and bridges won't do you any good in a bank. You want liquid assets that can be repurposed for investing into a bank, and I'll describe what that means in a minute. So I highlighted those in red in the report, and I added them up on the bottom. Now you have to add 3 zeros to everything because everything is in thousands here. So when you look at the total column, the next to last column, if you look at the total, that's actually $2 billion, not 2 million. And that's just on 5 categories, cash and cash equivalents, and deposits and investments and treasurer's account and that sort of thing. And then there are also what are called proprietary funds, which is another category of funds. And again, they have cash on deposit and on hand and equity and treasurer's accounts and other assets, but I just use those 2 here. So you can get some more money from that. And then the big kahuna. The big kahuna is the pension fund, and it's big not only because it's so large, but also it tends to be all liquid assets. Occasionally they have real estate and more fixed assets, but basically it's all liquid. So that totals $6.6 billion. Remember, add the 3 zeros. And so that's the pension trust funds, and there's also some money in separate agencies. So somebody commented in the background, there's no money tree, but there is the pension fund, so that's close to it. And then there's 218 million in separate agency funds as well. Now, I know from the chat that there's a little confusion. I also know from the last 10 years of working on this, there's a little confusion between deposits and capital. So let me very briefly say what the difference is. Deposits are short-term, moving in and out to meet city, in this case, City of Philadelphia needs, and they do have to be larger than the loan portfolio. Now, the capital is there for the long term. That doesn't move in and out. That has to stay with the bank, and that can be, in this case, retained. Let's say you use the pension fund to use that to create the capital, and that can be retained with interest and repaid in less than 20 years. In other words, the return on investment to the pension fund would be in less than 20 years, and I know this because I modeled it. But it's only 1/9 the size of the loan portfolio, which is very good because then when you're repaying that capital, you don't have to repay something that's as big as the loan portfolio. You only have to repay something that's 1/9 the size, and therefore you can even pay off 5% a year and still leave enough money for the bank to make a profit and to grow and to make more loans over that period. So it's roughly 15 years, depending on how you set up the bank. But let's say you take out 5 to 10% of the pension fund and repurpose that and put it into the capital for the bank, and then you'll have enough to do that part. And then you use the money that comes in the general and proprietary funds as deposits, the way the Bank of North Dakota does with tax revenues, and then you'll have your deposits. Okay, so now why would you do that? Why would the pension fund give that up? Well, here's the truth, and this is kind of the awful truth. So the pension fund, this is a direct quote out of pages 109 through 110, seeks a return of not less than 7.55% over a full market cycle. But, also quoting, for the year ended just recently, the annual money-weighted rate of return on pension plan investments, net of pension plan investment expense, was only 1.89%. So this is a direct quote. I emphasize it here, but it's a direct quote. So they're not getting anything close to 7.55% really ever, because there's always fees and there's always expenses. And in fact, sometimes they make less money because of the fees, even while it looks like they're making a positive return. So what do they have in, their money invested in that's providing a return? Well, you can see one page here, which is also on page 110. This is all the categories that they invest in, includes private equity, international small caps, U.S. and global equity, high yield instruments, public REITs, I mean, a lot of things. And it's pretty hard to make the case that these are more or less risky, actually, than a well-run public bank would be. So let me go to the next page. So if you're still not convinced, so these are some of the foreign currencies that the pension fund currently owns, and pretty much covers the whole world. And you can judge for yourself if you think that those countries are more safe to invest in their currencies than investing in a local public bank in Philadelphia. They also invest in derivatives, and of course derivatives are scaled and leveraged and are worth on paper a lot more than the money that goes into them, but they're highly leveraged and very risky investments. So there's a whole slew of pages from 111 to 115 that describes the investment risks. Then again, I mentioned the fees. Okay, so the standard management fund management fees. First of all, there's over 100 investment managers paid by the pension board, so that's a lot of people to be paying. So you have to wonder whether it's worth it. So then there's broker fees or trading costs. Every time you make a purchase, of course, and anybody who has a stock portfolio knows this, you have to pay trading costs. So the city is no different. They also have to pay a broker. Then there's something called reporting fees. And when I did this a few years ago, it was to JP Morgan. That's a fee just to report on what the city owns. And so when they want to get the report, they actually have to get this report and pay for it. So there's other fees. If you have a hedge fund, which Philadelphia did and probably still does, you pay 2 and 22% for showing up and 20% of any profits. So right away, that's a big haircut. Then there's fund expenses if you own mutual funds or additional expenses. Then there's fees and cities pay for withdrawing from those hedge funds or from other funds too, maybe. So how bad is it really? So it's not just Philadelphia. Here in New York City, where I am, this comptroller, Scott Stringer, said in a 2015 report, when you do the math on what we pay Wall Street to actively manage our funds, it's shocking to realize that fees have not only wiped out any benefit to the funds, but have in fact cost taxpayers billions of dollars in lost returns. Now, this is over a 10-year period. So in other words, he's saying that the fees have gobbled up all the returns over a 10-year period. And that's pretty extraordinary when you think about it, that New York City hasn't made any money, even though it looked like on paper it did. All right, so what are you allowed to invest in? Again, I mentioned those categories before, but these are things you can invest in, alternative investments. They may be hedge funds, they may be private equity, and they could be real assets and real estate debt. There's a lot of opportunistic funds as well. So in addition, can a public bank be one of those alternative assets? And if you read this paragraph carefully, it almost looks like there's alternatives to the alternatives. So I think that's something that a good public campaign to force or at least convince the pension fund managers to invest a part of their fund in a public bank, which is counter-cyclical, meaning it will go up or perhaps when the rest of the assets go down, is a good investment. So now, remember, so we're not trying to change the fund uses. In other words, they're still going to pay the pensions, but we want to change the investments that the pension makes. So remember, the pensioners are only getting about 5% a year. The other 95% of the pension fund has to be rolled over every year and never paid to the pensioners. Otherwise, the pension would run out because they only get about 5%. I mean, they say 7%, but as we've seen, they don't. And the reason they actually get 5% is because they've got fees that come out of employees and employers that actually pay into the pension fund in addition to what the pension fund makes on the market. So these are ways that investments in a public bank could be more prudent and safe, counter-cyclical, as I mentioned, able to provide consistent returns, supportive of local community and job creation, as everybody has talked about before me, and fiduciarily responsible. So now I just want to mention that although tax revenues are used throughout the year, this usage is predictable and these revenues can form the deposit base for making loans. And that's how the Bank of North Dakota has worked since 1919. So the way to get this set up is, I'm almost out of time, is determine how much money the bank will need for a startup, calculate and project the results. And this I've done for Philadelphia. I'll show that on the next slide. Get all the operating ratios and then ascertain the assets from the CAFR, look to the pension fund resources, of course, get professional bankers involved to confirm all these assets. And as you all are, elect city champions and public allies. So this slideshow is up here, which I'll paste in the chat in a minute. And there's also a live presentation I did in Philadelphia when we were still doing things live. And that was from 2011, even though I updated it in 2013. Those are the links to that. And then I have a much deeper presentation called How to Start a Public Bank, which actually comes with a 20-page manual where I model a public bank in Oakland and also New Hampshire. And therefore, you can see exactly how it's done on a spreadsheet over 8 years and see all the returns and all the operating ratios. And I'm using a basic banking model, and you can see how it would actually work. So that's it. Thank you very much.
That's great, Scott. Thank you so much. Really, a lot to consume, and it's good to be able to have access to it. Scott has looking at things from a different approach to how we would typically capitalize a bank. Philadelphia has taken a different approach to how it's going to create a public bank. And Councilmember Green and Stan Shapiro, who have been at the forefront of moving this in the last couple of years, are going to describe the legislative process that is underway in the city. Councilmember Green.
Actually, I'm going to start, Walt. So thanks.
Okay, great.
Yeah. So those who don't know, I'm a co-founder of the Coalition, co-founder of Philly Neighborhood Networks, and in my former life, I was chief staff attorney to Philly City Council. So I'm going to provide some details about the specific legislation that's now pending in council to establish a Philadelphia public bank. For reasons we don't need to get into right now, our bank is going to be established either as an authority or a subsidiary of an authority. PA authorities are granted expansive and virtually unlimited financing powers. Using this method avoids the need for special state legislation, which, given the nature of our legislature, is a good thing because we will never get any legislation through this particular legislature. But luckily, we do think we have authority from existing state law to create this bank. So the bill's most important feature, that is of the bill that's already been introduced, is the composition of its board. As Elizabeth Warren has famously said, personnel is policy. Our board will be made up of folks whose very self-definition involves service to communities that are starved for credit. Specifically, 6 of the 13 board members will come from a list of folks who are activists in one or more of the following areas: environmental justice, racial justice, low-income housing, public education, public health, co-op development, neighborhood-based small business development, gender justice, public transportation. 3 others would represent financial sectors whose lending policies mostly or entirely focus on local, mostly underserved Philadelphia communities, 1 from the credit union sector, 1 from the community bank sector, and 1 from the CDFI sector. A board like this, we think, can be counted on to implement the purposes of the authority as set forth in the bill. That's not going to be left to chance. These purposes are squarely targeted on community needs, namely renewable energy and energy efficiency enterprises and projects, low-income housing availability, co-op business development, enterprises paying family-sustaining wages, businesses creating new employment opportunities, transportation projects, other enterprises and activities fulfilling the needs of marginalized communities. In drafting the bill, we've been very aware that a major objection that the banker lobby will offer to our public bank is the specter of corruption. Only the private sector, is corruption-free. That's what they'll tell you. So in any event, we think that in addition to assuring that the bank will serve those who really need help, the membership of the board will insulate it from the problem. There will simply not be any elected politicians who can hand out favors who are on the board, and the actual board membership will be dominated by individuals who have a track record of working in the community interest. But there are other specific provisions that will ensure that the bank is corruption-free. Among other things, the city controller will audit the bank's financials annually and audit its performance every other year. That doesn't take place with Wells Fargo or Citizens Bank right now. We don't know what they do with our money. The bank is also going to be required to seek oversight from state and federal regulators. Finally, all board members, employees, and contractors of the bank will be, or agents of the bank will be subject to the provisions of the city's strict ethics code, and their actions will be subject to review by the city's independent ethics board. Penalties for self-dealing will be swift and significant. So those are the most significant aspects of the legislation. There are legal issues that have been raised that may require some tweaking, but not in our view in any significant way. There is also the possibility that we may need regulatory approvals of various kinds before the bank can take city deposits, but we believe there will be other sources of funds available to it so that initial loans can move out of the bank within a relatively short time. If we get this bill passed, we are on the verge of a wholly new and different credit system in the city in the very near future, and we should all be excited about this possibility. So that's my presentation. I'm going to turn it back to Councilmember Green.
Thank you, Stan, for that overview. And that's want to give some additional perspective on this legislation and how we got to where we are currently. So this initial conversation started based on a conversation I had with Stan Shapiro, Peter Winslow, Susan Wendell, other members of the Philadelphia Public Banking Coalition, where we actually had hearings in City Council to start to open up the conversation and thought of, could we have a public bank here in the city of Philadelphia? From there, we were able to work through the budget process to identify resources to bring in a national consultant, HRNA, to kind of give us an overview of what was happening in other jurisdictions and also make the case for public banking in Philadelphia. And we were able to do that. Coming out of that report done by HRNA, we also had some other additional studies that we did with students from Fells and as well as other former staffers from City Council. We used all that information to put together the blueprint that Stan just talked about. Now, unlike other jurisdictions like California, which have had enabling legislation at the state level, we're dealing, as Stan stated, with a very challenging, and I'm being politically correct, challenging General Assembly in reference to trying to create a public bank in the city of Philadelphia. In addition, there are various interests that do not want to see a public bank in Philadelphia and have raised and will continue to raise some of the things that Stan just mentioned. So we had to be creative in reference to how do we create this type of entity in the city of Philadelphia now, but also give us the flexibility that we can expand going forward to do additional things. My perspective and background, having started as a banker with a regional bank called Meridian Bank, back in the early 90s when I came out of University of Virginia, and also knowing some of the challenges some of the other newer banks have had, we use the information from HRNA and the other research we did to draft the legislation that Stan talked about to create a municipal authority that will have the ability to do all the concepts we're talking about in reference to public banking. Now, we've had other municipal authorities that have been created. Philadelphia, for example, if you're familiar with the Philadelphia Energy Authority, they are the entity that have been doing the Solarize Philly initiative and helping to really grow solar opportunities here in the city of Philadelphia. And I've worked closely with Emily Shapiro and the Philadelphia Energy Authority, as well as I created a Philadelphia Health Authority as well. So we had a blueprint in reference to how we would start the legislation, but then we want to incorporate into this public bank authority concept the various things that Stan talked about. When you see San Francisco and they're talking about issues like affordable housing, LA is talking about affordable housing. And when you heard when Andy Morrison talked about cooperative work, those are some of the things that we wanted to have into the banking authority in reference to the leadership of this organization, that people that had that type of background that could bring that type of focus to this entity. Because when I look at public banking, I'm looking at how do we address issues in areas that are not being addressed by traditional lending and by traditional institutions, and how can we support non-traditional entities that are doing great work in our city. So when you think about cooperatives who maybe have challenging be able to raise additional capital, how can a public bank help a cooperative? Or affordable housing or alternative energy opportunities. And that's where I see this public bank coming into that perspective. So since we have drafted the bill that Stan talked about that was introduced in January of 2021, we've also been providing additional resources to help us move through all the complex regulatory issues to move forward with the legislation. So we have engaged an outside law firm, Holland & Knight, who has been meeting with us on a weekly basis. We've also been meeting with the law department and the treasurer's office also on a weekly basis to work through all the myriad legal regulatory issues in order to have us move forward with a public bank. Now, there is a little bit of competition. I did see that in the chat feature, that if we're able to get this over the finish line, we would beat San Francisco and my friend President Walton, who's also trying to create their public bank. But I think we have a real opportunity getting through these issues, and as we go into the fall, to make those legislative changes that we need to make this entity operational. But we've also been looking at not just the legal and regulatory issues, but some of the capitalization issues that Scott Baker talked about. We met recently with City Controller Rebecca Reinhardt. In her role, she sits on a lot of those boards that deal with city resources. We'll be having a follow-up meeting with her in early October so we can continue to identify resources that could be available for a public bank. In addition, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the $1.4 billion that came to the city of Philadelphia through the American Rescue Plan, through the Biden administration. That also provides some opportunity for capitalization for the public bank. And then we have other ideas that could be possible for capitalization by issuing debt by way of the city to help form the capitalization for the public bank. So I think at this point, there are a lot of opportunities and perspectives to allow us to move forward with the legislation, to have this legislation passed soon, and then allow us to go into next year's budget cycle to really focus on, okay, now we've got the public bank passed into council. I had 11 co-sponsors for this legislation, and then move into the lobbying efforts to make sure we have the capitalization we need for the public bank. Now, through our conversations, both with the Philadelphia Public Bank Coalition and the Law Department, the Treasurer's Office, and Holland and Knight, we've also been talking with other organizations that are forming these similar but different entities at the same time. So I spoke about the Philadelphia Energy Authority. They have created a subsidiary called the Philadelphia Green Capital Corporation. That's a nonprofit that will actually launch in about 2 weeks. So they're looking about $1 to $2 million in operational dollars they'll need to get started. Also, the Philadelphia Housing Development Corporation just recently launched the Accelerator Fund. They also looked at a $1 to $2 million initial operating costs for that organization. So the fact that we are creating this public bank at the same time, similar but different entities are also being started at the same time that can help to address some of the issues in our city, I think provides us with a good roadmap to get the public bank started, and also provides some ability to not reinvent the wheel in reference to starting a new organization like the public bank. So I feel very strongly in reference to the passage of this bill, the fact that we have 11 co-sponsors, and also based on the fact that there's a lot of energy. And I think one of the benefits of this visioning summit, in addition to the town hall, is that there are probably other ideas that we have not thought about that could be part of the public bank concept. You heard a lot about providing access to credit for small businesses, minority businesses in the city of Philadelphia who need that access to credit in order to grow, but also about affordable housing development to help grow more affordable housing in the city of Philadelphia, which we know is a major issue in our city. Cooperatives. I know I'm a longtime member of Weaver's Way. Shout out to my friends in the Northwest. But we have other cooperatives in other parts of the city and also outside the city that are trying to grow. And there could be other ideas that could be a good opportunity for the public bank. So what I would say is, for those of you who've had an opportunity to participate in this summit, continue to send us questions, participate in our monthly Financing Philadelphia Future events where we bring different speakers in. Ask your member of council if you're in the city of Philadelphia, or if you're outside the city, ask your other elected officials what you are doing, or have you thought about a public bank? And for those who are outside of Philadelphia or outside of California, and you're not familiar with a public bank initiative being started in your jurisdiction, ask your elected official to at least start the process with a hearing, because that's how we got started here in Philadelphia. And I think that's what's going to help us move forward based on the grassroots work of all those who've been engaged to bring this idea to myself and to other elected officials. And that's how you can move public banking in your jurisdiction.
Thank you for that. All right, we are winding down now, but we're going to have some time for a Q&A for those last sessions. We talked about the actual legislation, and before that, we heard about where does the money come from. So, Beth, do you have any questions?
I do, Vanessa. So the first comes from Thomas. He asks, can there be a mandate in the charter requiring lending for accessible or affordable housing for households earning 50% or less of AMI, or green energy, food co-ops, things like that? I think we've talked about that a little, but I think it's a more specific question about, can that be mandated in the charter?
Those are good questions in reference to those type of perspectives. I think Thomas, that's probably Thomas Earls, a good friend of mine from Liberty Resources. As someone who is a strong proponent for accessible housing, especially with those that have physical and learning differences, that's a focus that we should have. I don't remember in the original bill if we said affordable housing, but I don't think we had a specific language regarding that. So that's something we can revisit as part of this entity. And the other thing is that we will have part of this initiative that actually does the lending, kind of like a loan committee that's going to be insulated from other perspectives of the organization. So these could be part of the underwriting guidelines for some of the loans and other products that come out of the public bank.
Thank you. Okay, Beth, I'm going to go back to you for another question, but if I can add something to that statement, remember that this public bank is really going to be a support system for the lenders that already exist. And so, there are many community development financial institutions, CDFIs, that are already doing some type of lending to underserved or more challenged communities. There's actually specifically something called the Assistive Technology Loan Fund that already exists. So, and that works with many disabled people to access to all sorts of technology and other resources, including housing.
And Vanessa, if I could just touch on that real quickly, because I know there's been some concern that I've heard from friends in the CDFI community. Well, if you bring a new entity, is that going to impact other community development financial institutions? And so the role I see the public bank is going to help augment the work of CDFIs. Could a CDFI borrow from the public bank? Could the public bank provide a credit enhancement or letter of credit to a CDFI so they can borrow even more money from those type of investors to help grow CDFIs, or work in partnership? So I don't really see the public bank in competition with a CDFI or the credit union, or even some of our other smaller community-based banks. I think that's a misnomer, that people are concerned that this public bank is going to take resources from existing community development financial institutions. And to me, the goal is to have augment and support the work and do work in partnership with them.
Absolutely. Thank you. Next question.
Okay. Most recently, Domita asked this, but a number of people have asked in various forms. How do we ensure that the board members of the bank are not political appointees or nominated as personal favor of the nominating committee or group?
That's an excellent
Let me
point.
take that. Can I take that?
Stand and I'll follow up. You're good.
Because I've got the legislation in front of me and had a hand in drafting it. So, that was in our minds when we drafted it, and there is no 100% guarantee. I think that won't happen. All suggestions are welcome, but personnel is policy, as we've said, and we've guaranteed that the members of the board will be nominated from groups that kind of guarantee that they'll have a public interest. 6 have got to be representative of the groups that I mentioned actually in my presentation, but those nominees have to have been recommended to council by organizations concerned with the issues that the public bank has got to be focused on. So the mayor will not be able to present nominees out, based on his or her own connections, but we'll have to wait for nominees that are sent by active community organizations that have been involved with these issues for a long period of time. We think that that will provide some reason to believe that the board is actually going to be responsive to all of us rather than to special interests. But the bottom line is we are going to have to be vigilant all through this process. All of us are going to have to be vigilant all through this process to be sure that the entity does not get co-opted. I think there are good structures in the legislation to help prevent that, but the only sure guarantee of it is an active movement that monitors this and intervenes in this every step of the way.
And just to follow up on Stan, and Stan, thank you for that, because we spent quite a bit of time in the drafting process to make sure that individuals that would be nominated have that requisite background and expertise and years of expertise in those areas that align with the goals and mission of this public bank initiative. In addition, we've had conversations with the ethics board in reference to how we can adopt part of the ethics board oversight into the legislation so that we can voluntarily adopt a regulation or perspective in the legislation that gives the ethics board oversight of this entity. And then the other point I'll say is that we're also trying to have the public bank as a community development financial institution in itself. In order to meet the CDFI test, and there's an 8-step process, you cannot be controlled by the public sector or the government. So you have to demonstrate in your application you're not government controlled. So that's another aspect. So as we're going through the amendments for the legislation and for this entity, we're going to be very specific to make sure that we meet the CDFI test. And we've been working with the Accelerator Fund from PHDC, which also is going through that process as we speak. So that provides another check to make sure that this entity is not government controlled in order to become a community development financial institution, which will help us do an even better job as a public bank.
Great, Beth. I think we can have one more question.
Okay. 80 asks, will the public bank have a lender of last resort in case of financial crisis, such as the Federal Reserve?
Well, we'll be seeking privileges at the Federal Reserve. It's going to be a long and winding route, but that is absolutely an objective that we all have for this institution.
And we have had conversations with the Federal Reserve as well as the U.S. Treasury. One of the challenges that with the Federal Reserve, we have to be a depositor in the Federal Reserve. So we've actually got to grow this entity, but we'll continue to have those conversations. And we're trying to draft the legislation to be as broad as possible. So even though we started initially in step 1, we have the ability through steps 2, 3, 4, and 5 to do even more things going forward.
All right, that was asked. Beth, one more question. Let's get one more in.
Okay. Ariel asks, how will we ensure that the Chamber of Commerce or big banks don't water down the current bill language?
Good. Say that once again, Beth.
How will we ensure that the Chamber of Commerce or big banks don't water down the current bill language if we're satisfied with how it is now, which I think.
Well, they would have to somehow maybe kidnap me and bring a Manchurian Councilmember Derek Green. I guess because I've worked, the difference I think is that I've worked in banking. So some of the pushbacks that they'll try to raise, I can say, well, I know your industry. So you're not going to be able to say, well, you can't do this or you can't do that. And I can say, well, you don't provide letters of credit. You don't provide, your whole focus is on risk and making a return on the deposits that people put into your bank. You give them a small rate of return, but you get a bigger rate of return on the loans that you do. That's your model. You bring in money and you lend it out. You give out less in deposit returns, but you bring in more in reference to the interest that you earned. That's your model. A public entity has a different risk profile. We're not trying to make profits. No, at best we'll break even. But the goal is to have an opportunity to provide resources for those entities, those industries like alternative energy, like affordable housing, like cooperatives, like some minority businesses that traditionally banks have not provided. So that's my response back to them. And the reason why there's a public bank, because you chose not to be in this space. You could have been in this space, but you had a profit motive that led to all the things we've been talking about prior to getting onto this panel.
All right, I'm going to do a couple of next steps that are really important because what we've been talking about all day is a pretty major change. And we need your help to do this. So prepare to make your voice heard. You will be getting an outreach toolkit via email from the coalition. As you heard, the legislation is now in the process of some amendments and changes. So you'll get that second version, essentially, of the legislation when that's done. We're not sure when that will be, just stay tuned. And what we're asking you to do when we send you that toolkit is to communicate to push the legislation forward, all right? And so you might be communicating with the mayor, with city council people, and as was briefly mentioned, at the state level, there may be some legislative barriers that we may need to get across. You may need to communicate with some of your Pennsylvania legislators. All right, so stay tuned for that. Also, and you can start this now, is recruiting 3 friends or family members or neighbors to help join you. The more we magnify the voices, the better. So in that toolkit, we'll get information about how to communicate effectively with those officials, and you'll get templates for social media and letters or emails. All right, thank you so much from this host for joining us. This was absolutely fantastic. And I'll now turn it over to Steve.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Vanessa. Yeah, thank you everyone for showing up and sticking with us for a few hours now. We hope, during these presentations today, you learned something new, you got inspired by our vision of what a public bank can do. I hope this event is your first step towards advocating together with us for a public bank here in Philadelphia. I think we had like 180 people on the call at our max. So, we're not alone, but if you get your family members, if you get your neighbors, if you get everyone involved and included, we could really show a powerful force. We've had great feedback from the survey. We want to double that. So we're going to stay on this call for a couple more minutes to give folks who haven't had a chance to complete the survey to complete the survey. Sorry, my 4 o'clock alarm, but the event over. So join the coalition, join any of the member organizations who sponsor this event today, and let's get a public bank accountable, not to shareholders, right? To people like us on this call, to the people in the city, a bank that would actually invest in our local communities here in Philly, and communities that Wall Street has too often, you heard from the speakers today, locked us out or completely left us behind. I want to thank all of the co-sponsors. Councilmember Derek Green mentioned them earlier. Philadelphia Neighborhood Networks, Our City, Our School, the Pennsylvania Working Families Party, Sustainable Business Network, Philadelphia Area Cooperative Alliance, Disabled in Action, Power, ACRE, Philly Revenue Project, the Public Banking Institute, Smart Collaboration, Reclaim Philadelphia, Liberty Resources Corporation. Thank you all for joining us.